This is a topic that has been pushed off for too long. It's especially important. It is really profound, and we have to remember that this is not something that is ancient history. This is something that we're talking the 1960s. We're talking about the lives of your grandparents. Many of you would be able to go home and ask about this time period. This is barely a lifetime ago. And so, to repeat something that likely has happened in class, I want to start by looking at some t shirts. The first of which is this one, Trayvon Martin, who was gunned down because he was wearing a hoodie and thought to be suspicious by George Zimmerman in a Florida town. This shirt came about with the acquittal of George Zimmerman, who was declared not guilty because he was using what's called the Stand Your Ground laws. If he felt he was threatened, then he is allowed to act with violence with a firearm. George Zimmerman, the one who shot Trayvon Martin. This one was Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. He was told to put his hands up, and he complied, and he was shot by a police officer. And that started a lot of civil unrest in Ferguson, Missouri. This one was Eric Garner, a man who was selling cigarettes on the street, which is illegal, but whenever he was detained or taken down by police officers, they put him in such a chokehold that he could not breathe. He declared as much, and no one stopped. And so he died from the police capture. This one, Tamir Rice and John Crawford III, were both Clevelanders who had toy guns. Tamir Rice I know better than the John Crawford story. Rice was in a Cleveland park, and he was playing with a gun that may or may not have had the orange end on it, and police arrived on the scene and fired before they could find out more of the situation. Crawford was in a similar situation with a toy firearm. Freddie Gray was in Baltimore, and he was taken by police for a minor crime, and he was put in the back of a police car. And when they arrived at the a police van, and when they arrived at the police station, he was found dead. And it came to light that there was a practice of taking people for a ride, as Baltimore police called it, to soften them up. But being in the back of that van, handcuffed and bound so that you cannot even protect yourself as you are flung around in the back of that van, led to Freddie Gray's death. I'm sure you all know this. Colin Kaepernick kneeling for the national anthem. He is still without a job, and now he has settled out of court with the NFL, meaning that there must have been some level of truth to his claim that the owners were all colluding against him to not sign him to any team. And you can say what you want about the American flag and the national anthem, but really, until this is no longer true, that that opinion doesn't mean all that much to me. Again, feel how you wish. But what's my point in all of this? Why do I do this? Because this story is clearly not over. This is not the civil rights movement has not ended. This is something that is ongoing. We are merely going to look at one of the more explosive chapters in it, in that where so much of what we consider to be the starts of a civil rights movement, and we're going to take a look at it in that way. So let's take what we saw with these pictures and rewind the clock to the 1950s at oddly enough, some high school students. These are protests against integrating schools, of trying to bring African Americans into white schools, and you can see how people thought about it. You can see the Confederate flag there. Of course, the rectangle version that I told you is not what was flown in the Civil War. That one was a square. Always find it interesting when they start including the Jewish people and labeling them as communists. This anti-Semitism that, I mean, the Holocaust was 10 years ago by the time this picture was taken, and yet we still see that kind of thing. It's strange, and no, I don't understand it. But these are the people who are on the wrong side of history. And whenever you get into a protest today, perhaps you should remember, well, what's it going to look like 50 years from now? Because that's really, we're not talking that long ago. And if you want a real response to the Colin Kaepernick and the flag, well, I think the rights are there. Remember that Jim Crow laws still exist. People are still segregated. And to put those three in a group together certainly should be telling. So it's one thing to look at pictures. Video is not what we want of the era. You know, they have news clips and such, but it's not everyday life. So I don't know if YouTube's going to allow this, so if there's a skip, that's why. I have a few clips from the movie Hidden Figures, which came out just a few years ago. And it was about NASA using people as computers. And in this case, computers meant computing numbers. They crunched the numbers on all the math of that very complex trigonometry and calculus to get astronauts into space, and more importantly, to get them back home to the Earth. And a large group of these women were African Americans, and even though they were computing the flight paths and the reentry windows for astronauts, their experience was still tainted by segregation. That even though they were some of the most brilliant minds in the country, they still were considered second-class citizens. And these clips should show you as much. And if it doesn't upload to YouTube, if they won't allow it, I encourage you to go and look for a couple of these clips on your own. I will include some links if they don't show. But if you get a skip, that's why.
We have liftoff.
If I've had to cut, welcome back everybody. Showed some clips from Hidden Figures, basically showing that the racism in the 50s and 60s was at such a level where I think even racists today would go, you're just being a jerk. It was above and beyond. And so I want to show something that, well, last year a film called Green Book came out, and that talked about what I'm about to show you. It showed it in movie form, while I'm telling the story of an African American musician. So let's take a look here of the real thing.
Imagine you're on a road trip with your family. The year is 1954 and you're black. Segregation is law in the South.
Imagine you're on a road trip with your family. The year is 1954 and you're black. Segregation is law in the South and basically practiced everywhere else in America. You're traveling down the famed Route 66 and you've just reached Albuquerque, New Mexico for the first time. There's not another town for miles and you want to pull over and sleep for the night. There are over 100 motels to choose from, but less than 8 will take you in. Picking the wrong one could lead to a humiliating encounter, or worse, a violent one. But there was actually a way to know where you'd be welcome. It was in the Green Book. Americans fell in love with the idea of the road trip in the mid-20th century. A growing middle class meant more people had cars and jobs with paid vacation time. And a newly built interstate highway system meant the country was accessible to a big part of the population for the first time. The open road indicated freedom, and traveling by car reflected Americans' image of themselves, self-sufficient, curious, and spontaneous. It was a way for families to spend time together and see the expansive country they called home, to experience America's cultural and natural diversity. Through the 1950s and 60s, the highway became the most common way for American families to travel. Motels and roadside attractions sprang up along the highway to accommodate travelers needing a place to sleep or eat at any point on their journey. But that freedom didn't extend to all Americans. Black motorists were turned away from the roadside hotels, gas stations, and restaurants that had taken over the American landscape. Some places were so hostile that it was unsafe to even get out of the car. Sundown towns forcibly expelled African Americans at night, sometimes violently. Black families had to take prepared food in case they wouldn't find a restaurant that would serve them, extra gallons of gasoline in case filling stations wouldn't sell to them, and even empty coffee tins in case they couldn't access a bathroom. They carried blankets and pillows, knowing that finding a safe place to sleep could mean camping by the roadside or driving long hours into the night, even though they had money to pay for a hotel. Sometimes that distance was fatal. It was the exact opposite of the spontaneous American road trip. But thanks to a Harlem postal worker turned travel agent, knowing where to go wasn't a total shot in the dark. In 1936, Victor Hugo Green collected information on hotels, restaurants, beauty salons, and mechanic shops that would reliably serve African Americans in New York City. He called his travel guide the Negro Motorist Green Book and began publishing an updated version each year. Using his network at the United States Postal Service, which was one of the largest single employers of African Americans at the time, Green put together detailed information on businesses and private homes that would welcome black travelers. The Green Book eventually grew to cover locations in all 50 states and sold ad space to businesses all over the country. With the help of Esso, now ExxonMobil, as a progressive corporate partner and distributor of the guides, around 15,000 copies of the Green Book started selling each year. Victor Green's once 16-page booklet ballooned to over 100 pages and became a staple item for black families who wanted to participate in the joy of cross-country travel. And it turns out that iconic image of the open road, of freedom and family values, would become an anchor in the civil rights movement. Dr. Martin Luther King even mentions it in his I Have a Dream speech.
We can never be satisfied as long as our body is heavy with the fatigue of travel, cannot gain lodging in the motels of the highways and the hotels of the cities.
The Civil Rights Act ended legal segregation in 1964, and just 2 years later, the Green Book went out of print. It had become obsolete.
Of segregation and racism go. The other thing is to talk about is redlining. So many people would like to say, well, this isn't an race thing, it's an economic thing. And, well, the economics happen to be racist. So, redlining is the act of forcing African Americans and other ethnicities to certain sections of the cities. Usually this is done by refusing to sell them houses outside of these sections, artificially inflating prices outside of these sections, and refusing loans if they're trying to buy a house that's not in these sections. And these sections were typically divided by red lines on maps, hence the name. So what does this do? Well, it's most of what you're able to borrow from is from what property you own. Whenever you borrow from a bank, you have to put up collateral. You have to put up something where if you don't pay your loan, the bank can take that and sell it and get their money back. And in most cases, this is your home. You mortgage your house, and therefore you can take out a large loan, and if you default on that loan, you don't pay it back, the bank can take your home. Well, you can only borrow against what that house is worth. And one, if you're renting, which in a lot of these situations African Americans were forced to rent because they would not be sold a home in anywhere that was worth buying, and so therefore they didn't have that property to borrow against, or your house is in a bad part of town because that's what you were forced to take, and you don't have as much to borrow against. So that impacts starting small businesses, which become large businesses. That impacts taking out loans for schooling and college. That impacts your ability to buy better real estate in the future. It is a long, arduous thing where, it may be economic, a lot of these issues, but the economics are racist. This is, I believe, Indianapolis, a city you wouldn't expect to see this in, a northern city. And yet, all of those red blocks were sold to and only to African Americans. And the rest of it was not things that they were allowed to buy. So you can see clearly this is economics and racism intermixed. for a lot of what we're going to talk about, the NAACP is the key group behind fighting for the rights of African Americans. They were founded in part by W.E.B. Du Bois, who we have talked about in the past. The NAACP stands for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and it is the group of African Americans for African Americans to try and make things better. And they were the ones helping in court cases like what we're going to talk about. The most important of these is Brown versus the Board of Education, which happens in 1954. Sometimes you'll see it as the Topeka Board of Education or Topeka, Kansas Board of Education because it happens in, believe it or not, Topeka, Kansas. Brown v. Board overturns Plessy v. Ferguson because Plessy v. Ferguson was about separate but equal. And it establishes that no, there is no such thing as equal when it comes to these schools. Indeed, the young woman in the case, she was being bused to a black school that was a couple of miles away, passing a white elementary school just a few blocks away on her way to school every day. And they sued, saying that, well, that's not right. Just let her go to the school that's right nearby her house. And so they went, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court, and Brown v. Board forces integration of schools, which really is the beginning of the end of segregation. So we can see that little girl here on the day where they won their court case, and you can see her in school. And so the start begins of trying to tear down segregation, but it would not go quietly, that's for sure. And one of those times where it would get so much worse. In 1955, a Chicago native, a teenager named Emmett Till, is visiting his family in Mississippi. I believe it was his great uncle he was visiting. And as a northern boy, he doesn't really understand the way of the South and how African Americans were supposed to know that they were inherently considered second-class citizens. And so Till speaks to a white woman in a shop in a way that she saw as disrespectful. So she tells some of her family, and Emmett Till would be tortured and murdered by two white men, thrown into the river, and later found. The jury would find the two white men innocent, and the woman would later admit that most of what happened did not happen the way she said it happened. This young boy was killed for nothing, and I'll let the experts talk more about this.
The brutal murder of 14-year-old Emmett Till remains one of the darkest moments in the civil rights era. On August 20th, 1955, the Chicago teen went to visit relatives in Money, Mississippi. While there, Till and a group of friends went into a store to buy candy. Unaware of the racial tone in the Mississippi Delta, Till spoke to a white female storekeeper in a manner she deemed offensive. On August 28, 1955, the storekeeper's husband, Roy Bryant, and his half-brother, J.W. Milam, abducted Till at gunpoint from his great-uncle's home. They drove him to a shed where they took turns torturing and beating him with a pistol. The pair then drove the battered teen to the edge of the Tallahatchie River. There they ordered him to remove his clothes and shot him in the head. Then they attached a heavy fan to his neck and rolled his body into the river. On August 31st, 1955, the body of Emmett Till was discovered by two young boys. Heartbroken and grief-stricken by the brutality of her son's death, Mamie Till Bradley defiantly held an open casket funeral in Chicago for her son. She even sent pictures of his disfigured body to newspapers and magazines, saying the whole nation had to bear witness to this. Blacks, including young kids like myself, saw this horrendous picture in Jet magazine and other black publications. In September 1955, Bryant and Milam were indicted for Emmett Till's murder. During the three-day trial, prosecutors presented testimony from Till's great-uncle and Willie Reed, an African-American sharecropper who overheard Bryant and Milam torturing Till. On September 23, 1955, after deliberating for just over 1 hour, the all-white male jury found the defendants not guilty. 7 years after their acquittal, one juror admitted during an interview that most of the jurors believed Bryant and Milam were guilty, but acquitted them because the mandatory punishment of life in prison or death seemed too harsh to impose on white
tragic, and Till was by no means the only one. So there's been an effort to try and map out all of the cases of lynchings and similar murders. This is something that everyone knew about. It was published in the local newspaper that it happened. And this is not just a problem of the Deep South. This happened here. You can see Fairfax County. There's a couple. Loudon right beside us. Fauquier just to the south. Just recently, there has been a monument put together in Montgomery, Alabama, to all of the lynchings. And it starts with a pillar for every town in which it happened. And the floor goes down beneath it until you're walking underneath those pillars. Clearly some symbolism happening. And they have some fantastic quotes for the hanged and beaten, for the shot, drowned, and burned, for the tortured, tormented, and terrorized, for those abandoned by the rule of law. We will remember. With hope, because hopelessness is the enemy of justice. With courage, because peace requires bravery. With persistence, because justice is a constant struggle. With faith, because we shall overcome. And it harkens back to where this all started with slavery and a sculpture meant to evoke a slave auction as a family is separated without their own consent, obviously. These people are torn from one another. And it has caused some issues locally in Montgomery. Usually we do a reading here, but we're going to skip it because, well, this is a flipped classroom endeavor where you can write down some notes. But it is intense, and it is traumatic, and it is absolutely something that we need to look at if we are ever to overcome the terrible things that we have done as a nation. Let us also talk about Montgomery, Alabama, but in a different context. I'm sure you've all heard this story, so I will keep it brief. Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat to a white man because she was already in the African American section. I have that wrong in the PowerPoint. She was already in the section that she was relegated to, and she was told to give up her seat to a white man, and she refused. She is not the first woman to have done this. She's not the first person to have done this and had that protest. There were women arrested for similar things previously. But Rosa Parks had a stellar reputation. She had no prior history of running into with law enforcement. And so the NAACP seized on her case to make a big deal of it, followed with a boycott and eventually the integration of public transportation. Let's take a look with an interview with Rosa Parks.
Now to one of the most memorable Americans ever to confront the issue of racial segregation head-on in this country 40 years ago. Rosa Parks, who in refusing to give up her seat on a city bus to a white man became... Now to one of the most memorable Americans ever to confront the issue of racial segregation head-on in this country 40 years ago. Rosa Parks, who in refusing to give up her seat on a city bus to a white man became the Mother Superior of the Civil Rights Movement.
This week, at the age of 82, she's traveling this country with a group of students, her story and what she is telling them in her own words tonight.
I remember well these struggles that we went through during my childhood when the Ku Klux Klan was very active. It just made us stronger to continue the struggle for freedom. This was the seat that I took as I got on the bus. A few white people boarded the bus, and one man was left standing, and I certainly did not plan to stand up, and I didn't consider myself breaking the law because I was in what was supposed to be our part of the bus. So my arrest brought about a protest from the people of Montgomery that lasted 381 days. And when we did go back on the bus, we didn't, the Supreme Court had handed down a decision that there would be no more racial segregation in transportation. When I was on the bus the time I was arrested, the only thing that was on my mind was that I did not want to be treated in that way.
It took her sitting down to get a people to stand up. And we can never, ever, ever forget her for that.
That happened to Rosa Parks in 1955. Just one more reminder that the happy-go-lucky 50s were not at all what they seem to be in rose-colored glasses of our memories.
Not all of these stories are as pleasant. Little Rock 9 always blows my mind. In 1957, Dwight Eisenhower, the president, orders Little Rock, Arkansas high schools to integrate their schools. They had held out for 3 years following Brown v. Board of Education, and so they were resisting, and Eisenhower says, no, you must follow the law. 9 students were chosen from African-American schools because they were excellent. They were tops of their class, and they felt that they would handle this and be an example for the rest of the school. They were chosen to choose the better Little Rock Central High School. The governor, Orville Faubus, orders the Arkansas National Guard to prevent those students from attending. Literally calls up the National Guard to stop these 9 children from going to school. And this next video I like because it takes a former president, Bill Clinton, who is grew up in Little Rock, Arkansas, and has him looking at what Dwight Eisenhower did. So we have a president talking about a former president, and one that was especially relevant to the man. So let's take a look.
Until the 1950s, America was a segregated society with separate schools, restaurants, parks, and water fountains for blacks and whites. In 1954, the Supreme Court rules that schools... Until the 1950s, America was a segregated society with separate schools, restaurants, parks, and water fountains for blacks and whites. In 1954, the Supreme Court rules that schools must be integrated. Resistance to this ruling spreads through southern states. As 9 black students attempt to enter Little Rock Central High School, Arkansas Governor Orville Faubus orders his National Guard to stop them.
My hometown was only 50 miles from Little Rock. We had a large African-American community. The schools were all segregated. It was a period, though, of basic calm and optimism in the aftermath of World War II. And I think that's really what laid the seeds of people wanting to have more activism from government at home and to do something about civil rights. After Brown v. Board of Education, Little Rock Central High School crisis was the first major resistance test. And I believed in integration, and so did my grandparents, and so did my mother. And I was appalled, but also surprised by the resistance that built up. I just turned 11. Eisenhower was the first president that I felt that I knew and had a connection to. And my family were all Democrats, but we liked him. He went out of his way not to raise the country's temperature, when you know you have the authority to do something and you're determined to do it and see it through, then it's better to talk more softly. It's better to be resolute without being arrogant. It was the right thing to do. It had to be done. The courts had ordered it, and these kids had a right to an equal education.
For a few minutes this evening, I should like to speak to you about the serious situation that has arisen in Little Rock. Disorderly mobs have deliberately prevented the carrying out of proper orders from a federal court. This morning, the mob again gathered in front of the Central High School of Little Rock. I have today issued an executive order directing the use of troops under federal authority to aid in the execution of federal law at Little Rock, Arkansas. The very basis of our individual rights and freedoms rests upon the certainty that the President and the executive branch of government will support and ensure the carrying out of the decisions of the federal courts, even when necessary, with all the means at the President's command. Mob rule cannot be allowed to override the decisions of our courts. If resistance to the federal court order ceases at once, the further presence of federal troops will be unnecessary, and the city of Little Rock will return to its normal habits of peace and order. Thus will be restored the image of America and of all its parts as one nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
What came across to me was he just said he wasn't going to tolerate it. The Supreme Court had made a decision. The law of the land had to be upheld, and the kids were going to get to go to school. This was a huge strategic decision because nationalizing the Arkansas National Guard to stop FOBUS from using them to keep the kids out, and then bringing in the 101st Airborne Division was pretty unprecedented in America. Had President Eisenhower not done that, it would have basically said Supreme Court doesn't really count if there's enough powerful opposition, that we can have two sets of laws, one for people who don't live in the South and one for people who do. It would have been unthinkable. And in the end, I think that's why he did what he did. He realized that as fraught with potential negative ramifications as his action was, the flip side was much, much worse. It was really the first time the country got to see him handling a crisis of the magnitude that he dealt with in his leadership in World War II. I learned a lot about how people who are determined to prevail do it without going out of their way to humiliate their adversaries or claim too much momentary credit. He knew that the record would be written in the legacy of the lives of the kids that went to school.
The country needs them and then can send the National Guard wherever he wants. So he basically steals the Arkansas National Guard out from Orville FOBUS. Eisenhower then orders the 101st Airborne Division, who we last talked about when they were trapped in Bastogne, France during the Second World War and were rescued by General George Patton. So having such a respected division that everyone knew, like, oh, this is serious. Those 101st Airborne Division of the U.S. Army would guard the students so that they could go to school successfully. But they could not go in the classrooms. They had to wait outside. And I'm sure you can imagine what could happen inside the classrooms. Long story short, at least at the end of the day, those 9 students would attend school successfully, but it was not without its issues. Let's hear from one of them.
The local newspaper, the Arkansas Gazette at that time, indicated that the Brown decision was going to change the face of the South forever. I remember those words. And I thought to myself, good, because I think the face of the South.
The local newspaper, the Arkansas Gazette at that time, indicated that the Brown decision was going to change the face of the South forever. I remember those words. And I thought to myself, good, because I think the face of the South ought to change.
I will not force my people to integrate against their will.
The governor of the state, Orville FOBUS, decided that he was going to use Central as his point of resistance. None of us of the 9 anticipated that the resistance would be as strong as it was. The night before we were to go to school, the governor called out the Arkansas National Guard, unbeknownst to us. And when we appeared at Central the first day, the National Guard was there to bar our entrance and let white students go into the school. What it was like, it was rejection that I had never experienced like that. It seemed to me that if they were going to all of this trouble to keep me out, there was something bigger than my simply going to class. Only when we got home from school that day did we realize what an ordeal, personal ordeal, Elizabeth had gone through, and that she certainly faced more of the mob directly. I always applaud the fact that she was able to keep both her composure and try to figure out how to get out of that. We started school on the 25th of September.
President Eisenhower sends 500 troops of the 101st Airborne Division of the United States Army.
It was a terrific feeling that President of the United States would send troops to escort us into school. I didn't know what was going to happen after that. It was like going to war every day. You had students who tried to use as much verbiage as they could to intimidate us. We had threats and comments that, we would be killed for all of us. We decided that this was a year that we were going to support each other. We were going to try to do as well as we could in our academic work. Some were a lot smarter than me, but I also was determined that this year I was going to graduate from Central. The principal of the school told me at one point along the way that I didn't have to come to the ceremony. They would mail me my diploma. And I thought, listen, I didn't go through all this to pass up the ceremony. Maybe the world thought that after Little Rock, everything is going to be fixed. And one of the important pieces, I'm sure I don't need it to remind anyone, that the history of slavery in this country makes it very difficult to overcome a lot of issues on race. We're a long way from being perfect, but we certainly are not what we were when I started out. I believe that our participation at Central is one of those many steps that's gone to change this country for the better.
In the girls' washroom and attempted to burn her by dropping pieces of flaming paper on her from above. Minnie Jean Brown was also taunted by members of a group of white male students in December 1957 in the school cafeteria during lunch. So she dropped her lunch, which was a bowl of chili, onto the boys, and she was suspended for 6 days. 2 months later, after more confrontation, Brown was suspended for the rest of the school year. She was transferred to New Lincoln High School in New York City. And white students were punished only when their offense was, quote, both egregious and witnessed by an adult. Otherwise, those African-American students would get no help. What is not usually talked about in this, and why I say at the end of the day they got their education, they lost a year. Orville Faubus lost an appeal to delay integration for 3 years. He said, give us 3 years and we'll make this happen. And Eisenhower in the courts said, no, you do it now. So Faubus, through special order of the governor, as governor, ordered all 4 Little Rock high schools closed. He couldn't close just one school. He had to close all of them. So no students, black or white, would go to school if the school was segregated, or it was not desegregated. Faubus tried to open private schools that would accept only white students and failed, and people blamed the black community for that because racism. Teachers were forced to swear loyalty oaths to Faubus decisions. Teachers also had to attend the school every day, even though that they had no students to teach. 44 teachers and administrators were fired because they refused to go along with this. Eventually, 3 segregationist school board members were replaced with moderates. Those 44 teachers and administrators got their jobs back, and school would open the next year. They lost a year because Faubus was throwing a temper tantrum over trying to integrate these schools and letting African Americans have an equal education. Important to notice that Orville Faubus would be governor through 1967, winning 3 more elections. Racism does not go away easily. Let's now look at what a similar situation, but this is for in Virginia. This is the local history, and they called it massive resistance.
A lot of the South was watching to see what Virginia would do. In the fall, the governor appoints what's known as the Gray Commission. In November of 1955, the Gray Commission issues a report. The key provision, and the most controversial one, was a recommendation that the state begin to make available tuition grants so that any white family that...
A lot of the South was watching to see what Virginia would do. In the fall, the governor appoints what's known as the Gray Commission. In November of 1955, the Gray Commission issues a report. The key provision, and the most controversial one, was a recommendation that the state begin to make available tuition grants so that any white family that objected to sending their child to a school which was integrated could get a tuition grant from the state to go to private school. In January of 1956, the state overwhelmingly voted to amend the Constitution to allow for tuition grants. The Gray Commission would actually have allowed some integration in places. It was very clear that Arlington especially was ready to integrate its schools. Also, mountainous parts of Virginia, very few African Americans. It would have made financial sense to integrate the schools because running two separate school systems was costly. So the fear was that there were parts of the state that would in fact comply with the court decision. And so for a lot of people in the southern part of the state, that was untenable. So it's in the spring, summer of 1956 that Harry Byrd and others began to try to formulate a plan. And this leads to the real showdown in August and September of 1956 when the governor calls a special session of the legislature and what come to be known as the massive resistance laws are passed. The most important components of Virginia's massive resistance laws were that the pupil placement was taken out of the hands of local officials and put in the hands of a state pupil placement board, so that meant that people in Arlington, for instance, could not automatically send to a formerly white school a handful of black students. Secondly, it's the massive resistance laws provided for tuition grants. Most importantly, though, what the massive resistance laws did is that they empowered the governor to take control of and close down any schools which integrated as a result of court orders. But on the other side of the issue, there were various people who made very clear that they were more committed to public education than they were to segregation. I think if you had surveyed most white Virginians at the time of the Brown decision, they would have preferred to maintain segregation, but that doesn't mean they're necessarily willing to defy the Supreme Court. If forced to choose between segregation and public education, they would prefer public education. The portions of the state which had the heaviest concentration of African Americans, most of whom were prevented from voting, were vastly overrepresented.
So the key takeaway there, and related to the Little Rock Nine, was that Virginia opened a number of private schools because these laws of integration only applied to publicly funded institutions. And so a private school can take whoever they want. And giving white students a chance to go to these private schools, to pay for these private schools with government money, was what Virginia did to resist integration. Certainly not something Virginia likes to talk much about, and why there isn't a more interesting video on the topic. But in a lot of places where private schools are the norm, there might be some relation to this. One of the other ways that African Americans protested were sit-ins. And a lot of this happened at Greensboro, North Carolina, probably the most famous of these. Many African-American college students would go to a counter and wait for service. And because they were at the white counter, service never came to help them. So they would simply wait until someone would come to them, even though they never would come. But what they were doing was taking up a spot. They were taking up a spot that one or even many white people, one after another, would have come and given business, paying money to these lunch counters, restaurants, delis, etc. So they slow down business, they make a financial cost to these segregated restaurants, and they make a statement. And many would be dragged off by police for doing nothing more than sitting there waiting for service. But there are also more active challenges, including the Freedom Riders. So along with the buses of Montgomery, Alabama, eventually all interstate highway transportation was ordered to be integrated because the national government owns the interstates. And that would include things like Greyhound buses and trains. So groups of students, white and black, decided to test this by riding a bus into the Deep South. And the story is incredible, just incredible.
occurred at the peak of the civil rights era in 1961. They were a response to a law that had been passed. So in 1961, a northern group of civil rights activists called CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, decides to test this law by calling together activists of different ages, of different races, of different educational and economic backgrounds, and of different religions to travel together, sitting side by side on interstate buses from Washington, D.C., all the way to the Deep South. Initially, the rides went very well. They would walk in as an integrated group, violating, the precepts of Jim Crow, and people wouldn't bother them. When they came to the Deep South, it was a different story. So their ride stalled. They encountered hostile, violent, angry mobs. The federal government sends in its officials to help them get out of there and flies them to New Orleans.
Do you feel that it's wrong to discriminate against a person solely on the basis of his race or color?
Diane Nash, who had led the Nashville sit-ins, heard about the Freedom Rides, heard about the trouble that the Freedom Riders had encountered, and she did not want the Freedom Rides to go down in the annals of history as a failure. She repeated the model of CORE, and they immediately encounter hostility again in Alabama. There's a notorious moment in Montgomery where the riders are badly beaten. Reporters who are filming the riders are badly beaten. The local African American church has a mass meeting to call attention to this problem. Dr. King is flown in. A mob of thousands surrounds the church and threatens to set the church on fire. Dr. King phones the Attorney General, Robert Kennedy, and after a long series of telephone calls with the governor of Alabama, Robert Kennedy sends in the National Guard to rescue Dr. King and his congregation. This is a moment of triumph for the civil rights movement because it shows that the federal government is willing to bring its full powers in support of the civil rights movement. So already the Freedom Rides are creating the kind of social change that the riders wanted to. The riders continue during this second round all the way to Jackson, Mississippi, with some degree of police protection. In Jackson, Mississippi, they are promptly thrown in a notorious prison called Parchman, which was well known for the kind of hard labor that the prisoners had to enact. Did this discourage the Freedom Riders? No. It strengthened their resolve. They practiced nonviolence in those jails when the guards were violent toward them. And they modeled to people in jail who had not been a part of the movement. They modeled to the people in jail how serious the motivations of the movement activists were and how transformative the movement was. In the end, the Attorney General was able to change the laws and interstate travel was finally really desegregated
ask simply,
as a result
would you get on the bus?
So the Freedom Rides are a major success
just,
for the civil rights activists.
Just astounding
in
what
the
people
early
did. I mean, they were arrested for simply riding the bus together. This is the level of racism and segregation in the South, and we cannot forget. Birmingham, Alabama was a flashpoint for much of this, in so much that it was nicknamed Bombingham. Marches would continue in Birmingham, Alabama. Black churches would be bombed across the city. In one such incident, 4 little girls were killed while they were attending Sunday school, or right after Sunday school. For this, there was major unrests and major protests, and Governor George Wallace would order in the National Guard to put down the trouble. We have some videos next. This is a compilation from the time. I want you to keep in mind that a firefighter's hose uses 300 psi for water. That's 300 pounds per square inch hitting you. And obviously this covers multiple square inches, so it is a lot of force. And at the end of this clip, they overlay some of a speech from Dr. King, and I want you to pay a special attention to that speech when it begins. But these images are heartbreaking. It's simply heartbreaking to watch.
Say to our white brothers all over the South who will try to keep us down, we will match your capacity to inflict suffering with our capacity to endure suffering. We will meet your physical force with soul force. We will not hate you, and yet we cannot in our good conscience obey your evil laws. Do to us what you will. Threaten our children and we will still love you. Come into our homes at the midnight hours of life and take us out on some desolate highway and beat us and leave us there, and we will still love you. Run all around the country and send your literature and say that we aren't worthy of integration, that we are too immoral, that we are too low, that we are too degraded, and yet we will still love you. From our homes and go by our churches early in the morning and burn them if you please. And we will still love you. But we will wear you down by our capacity to suffer. In winning the victory, we will not only win our freedom,
have that peaceful resistance is incredible. Considering what everyone here was enduring the law itself against them, and you still turn the other cheek. Just incredible. So I mentioned that George Wallace, the governor, was the one ordering the National Guard in to break these things up. Let's take a look at George Wallace, who is an astounding figure.
Today, I have stood where once Jefferson Davis stood and took an oath to my people. It is very appropriate that from this cradle of the Confederacy, this very heart of the great Anglo-Saxon Southland, that today we sound the drum. Today, I have stood where once Jefferson Davis stood and took an oath to my people. It is very appropriate that from this cradle of the Confederacy, this very heart of the great Anglo-Saxon Southland, that today we sound the drum for freedom, as have our generation of forebears before us done time and again down through history. Let us rise to the call of freedom-loving blood that is in us and send our answer to the tyranny upon the South. In the name of the greatest people that have ever trod this earth, I draw the line in the dust and toss the gauntlet before the feet of tyranny, and I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
Saying this about white Anglo-Saxons above anyone else, and calls upon the imagery of the Confederate States in the Civil War. He was beloved by his racists, and they came out to support him. He would run for the presidency and lost, thank goodness, but it certainly made a splash.
In this part of the country who are today calling for communist victory. And they say that's free speech. But they mean free speech only if you let them speak. They don't want anybody else to speak. And I tell you,
Governor Wallace used to just love to use the long-haired hippie agitators, the folks who were out in the front lines of the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement.
I love you too, I sure do. Oh, I thought you were a she, you a he, oh my goodness.
The folks that he felt like his constituency just really disliked the most, you know.
And when he was in California, a group of anarchists lay down in front of his automobile and threatened his personal safety, the President of the United States. Well, I want to tell you, if you'll elect me the President and I go to California, or I come to Arkansas and some of them lie down in front of my automobile, it'll be the last one they'll ever want to lie down in front of.
Again, what I said in the beginning, you fellas better have your day now because you're through later on. I tell you that much.
That would be the kind of pictures that we would want.
Well, just keep on. You get me 1,000,000 votes every time you show up. I tell you that
much. When on television, and particularly back home in the South,
come up here after I've completed my speech and I'll autograph your sandals for you.
People would just want to just leave the cotton fields early in the afternoon and get to the television and send whatever dollars they had right into the campaign headquarters. And by doing that, we were able to finance the campaign.
Why don't you young folks get out of the auditorium?
And I'll tell you what, I may not teach you any politics if you listen, but I'll teach you some good manners. I'll teach you some good manners.
Races throughout the South that kept him going. He harnessed that loudmouth, take them on. Just incredible. And I have one more clip of Wallace, and I want you to see if you can pick up what topic he's talking about here in a speech he gave in Virginia.
We're defending the right of the people of Virginia and of Alabama to decide some questions for themselves. And if you folks who have had some liberals to tell you about the Constitution, let me suggest that you go to your library and you read...
We're defending the right of the people of Virginia and of Alabama to decide some questions for themselves. And if you folks who have had some liberals to tell you about the Constitution, let me suggest that you go to your library and you read the debates in the Constitutional Convention of the state of Virginia, and you read the debates in the Constitutional Convention of the state of New York and of New Hampshire and of the original 13 states, and you will find that not a single one of the states wanted to come into the Union until first they were guaranteed that we were going to have a government of limited powers, that all powers not delegated to the government expressly would be lodged and kept with the people of Virginia and of New York and of New Jersey. And in the debates in New Jersey and New York, they said, we've got particular and peculiar problems in New York, and we want the right to determine those ourselves. And so they wouldn't even come into the Union until first they agreed to put the first 10 amendments in the Constitution. And so those in the Constitutional Convention sound exactly like we in Alabama sound, and sound exactly like many of you who are here today sound, and are completely attitude to those today who are interpreting the Constitution of our country.
Rights. In this case, the state right to segregate. Whereas 100 years ago, in 1863, we were talking about states' rights, fighting a war over states' rights for slavery. 100 years later, the same thing is happening. History may not repeat itself, but it certainly does rhyme. And this is one of the greatest examples of it. And the fact that this still pops up today with states' rights to infringe on the rights of individuals, it's still there and still extremely relevant. Let's switch gears a bit. There is someone who gets overlooked in a lot of this, a man named Malcolm X. Malcolm X is the counterpoint to Dr. King, in that Malcolm X didn't believe that passive resistance, that being peaceful, would change anything. He pushed for violence, and that not necessarily to wage war, but face violence with violence. He felt that fighting was the only way to get the attention of white Americans and have them actually do something about the plight of African Americans. And so let's take a look at a video, a biography of Malcolm X.
Malcolm X was an American revolutionary. An electrifying spokesman for the Nation of Islam, Malcolm X fought to attain civil rights through militant self-defense.
This will be an organization that will give the...
Malcolm X was an American revolutionary. An electrifying spokesman for the Nation of Islam, Malcolm X fought to attain civil rights through militant self-defense.
This will be an organization that will give the black man in this country the right to defend himself by any means necessary.
Born Malcolm Little on May 19, 1925, in Omaha, Nebraska, Malcolm grew up in East Lansing, Michigan, where he suffered the death of his father in 1931. Several years later, Malcolm's mother was placed in a mental institution, and he lived in foster homes until he dropped out of school at 15.
Malcolm X was a brilliant young man, but he told the teacher he wanted to be a lawyer, and that teacher suggested instead that he be a carpenter. That begins Malcolm X's sort of slow slide out of school.
After moving to Boston, Malcolm fell into a life of drugs and crime, and at 20 years old, he was sentenced to 10 years in jail for larceny. While imprisoned, Malcolm joined the Nation of Islam,
and upon his release in 1952, he changed his name to Malcolm X.
Most people who are from formerly enslaved Africans carry the last name of their former masters or those families, and Malcolm X basically let go of that name, and he chose X to symbolize his unknown African name.
From 1952 to 1960, Malcolm X expanded the Nation of Islam from roughly 400 to 40,000 members. But as an opposing voice to integration, Malcolm X incited fear and controversy.
Malcolm X was the counterpoint to Dr. King and the Civil Rights Movement. They were talking about nonviolence and peace and love and cooperation. Malcolm never participated in violence, but he was definitely about, we have to fight back. He spoke for so many African Americans who were literally terrified of saying the things that he was saying.
Anyone who stands in the way of your and my freedom, our human dignity, is a cold-blooded, blue-eyed enemy.
What Malcolm X did that drew so many people to him was he had an energy that was urgent and young. And I think he triggered a certain kind of action in people, a certain kind of self-esteem that I'm worthy of challenging the status quo.
In 1963, tensions erupted between Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam due to his growing popularity and his objection to the extramarital affairs of Elijah Muhammad, the Nation of Islam leader. By 1964, Malcolm X left the Nation of Islam and converted to Sunni Muslim.
Malcolm X had this life-changing event when he went to Mecca. He went outside of America and connected to the global image of Islam. He came back differently and felt that everyone was his brother.
On February 21st, 1965, while preparing for a speech in a Manhattan ballroom, Malcolm X was rushed by 3 gunmen from the Nation of Islam and was killed by 21 shots to his body.
A reading of a speech by Malcolm X
posthumous
in class.
autobiography,
You can definitely
published
see
in 1965, was named by Time magazine as one of the 10 required nonfiction books of all time.
I like to contrast that
in
with the I Have a Dream speech by
starring
Dr. Martin
Denzel
Luther
Washington.
King. Happened August 28, 1963. And if you go to the Lincoln Memorial, on one of the steps where it happened, you see that engraving, and I encourage you to look for it next time you're there to see the vantage point that he had. Instead, we will look at the I Have a Dream speech in its entirety. It's the only speech I look at from beginning to end, and we'll do that in class as one of our activities. It's an incredible speech. It's so well written, and every bit of it is fantastic. So the Civil Rights Act, 1964, is what comes from all of this. It ended segregation in public places and banned employment discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. This makes it illegal to discriminate in any sort of public anything, or to discriminate in the private sector through employment. You need to know that part of it. It would get boosted in 1988. Any private company that gets federal funds must not discriminate, or else it will lose those federal funds. And in 1991, people can act on this. So if they can sue for damages if they believe they were denied jobs or services because of their race. And this is being extended to other groups as we move on. And hopefully it only continues.
Congress passes the most sweeping civil rights bill ever to be written into the law, and thus reaffirms the conception of equality for all men that began with Lincoln and the Civil War 100 years ago. The Negro won his freedom then. Congress passes the most sweeping civil rights bill ever to be written into the law, and thus reaffirms the conception of equality for all men that began with Lincoln and the Civil War 100 years ago. The Negro won his freedom then. He wins his dignity now. 5 hours after the House passes the measure, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is signed at the White House by President Johnson. Before an audience of legislators and civil rights leaders who had labored long and hard for passage of the bill, President Johnson calls for all Americans to back what he calls a turning point in history.
We must not approach the observance and enforcement of this law in a vengeful spirit. Its purpose is not to punish. Its purpose is not to divide, but to end divisions, divisions which have lasted all too long. Its purpose is national, not regional. This Civil Rights Act is a challenge to all of us to go to work in our communities and our states, in our homes and in our hearts, to eliminate the last vestiges of injustice in our beloved country. So tonight I urge every public official, every religious leader, every business and professional man, every working man, every housewife, I urge every American.
But that would not be the end of it. Just because it banned discrimination in the workplace and in public places, this did not get many African Americans to vote. You remember the literacy test we took in the Reconstruction Unit. That literacy test was from Louisiana in the 1960s. So these are still going on. And of course, none of us, and I include myself, could have passed that test in any way, shape, or form. So African Americans were still kept from voting and therefore kept from changing anything. And so they planned a march to raise awareness, a march that would go from Selma, Alabama to Montgomery, Alabama. 55 miles they marched to raise awareness. The first attempt to do it was broken with violence. And so let's look at someone who personally experienced this. John Lewis, who is now a U.S. congressman. There he is in the Selma March on the left, and him in the 50th anniversary of the Selma March on the right. And John Lewis actually came to speak at Westfield just a few years ago. I am so jealous of those who got to see it. He came before I came here. So let's listen to him speak about his experience, because, well, I can't do it justice the way he can.
Almost 50 years ago, as a young person, I was part of an effort fighting for the right to vote, the right to participate in the democratic process. All across the American South.
Almost 50 years ago, as a young person, I was part of an effort fighting for the right to vote, the right to participate in the democratic process. All across the American South, people of color could not register to vote. In my native state of Alabama, individuals had the count the number of bubbles in a bar of soap, the number of jelly beans in a jar. People stood in unmovable line. There were African American lawyers, physicians, high school teachers, college professors were told they could not read or write well enough. We had to change that. People have been beaten, arrested, and jailed. So after one young man was murdered in Alabama during a nonviolent peaceful protest, we decided to march from Selma to Montgomery to dramatize to the world that people of color wanted to be able to cast a vote and have some say and control over their own destiny. On that march, 600 of us, children, young adults, men and women, line up to walk 50 miles from Selma to Montgomery. I was much younger, had all of my hair and a few pounds lighter. We started walking. We came to the highest point on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Down below we saw a sea of blue, Alabama state troopers. We came within hearing distance of the state troopers. A man identified himself and said, "I'm Major John Cloud of the Alabama State Troopers. This is an unlawful march. It would not be allowed to continue. I give you 3 minutes to disperse and return to your homes or to your church. Young man walking beside me from Dr. King's organization said, "Major, give us a moment to kneel and pray." And the major said, "Troopers, advance." And you saw these men putting on their gas masks. They came toward us, beating us with nightsticks and bull whips, trampling us with horses, and releasing the tear gas. I was hit, beaten, knocked down, left bloody, unconscious. I thought I saw death. I thought I was going to die. But because of what happened in Selma, there was a sense of righteous indignation. Young people and people not so young came to Selma. And 3 weeks later, we marched all the way from Selma to Montgomery with the protection of the federal government. And President Johnson made one of the most meaningful speeches any American president had made in modern time when he introduced the Voting Rights Act of 1965. 3 months later, the Voting Rights Act was passed and signed into law. So today, Selma is different, America is different. If it hadn't been for the Voting Rights Act, I wouldn't be a member of Congress. And so many other people wouldn't be elected in many positions all around our country. President Obama wouldn't be in the White House. But there's an attempt to take us back to another point, to another place. We made too much progress, and we're not going back. I said to you as young people, you too can do something. You too can find a way to get in the way, get in good trouble, necessary trouble. I was arrested and jailed 40 times during the 60s. But I never gave up. I never became bitter or hostile. And as we think about Selma, 50 years later, we cannot give up. We cannot get lost in a sea of despair. We must be hopeful and optimistic and say, yes, we too can do something. We too can make a contribution. You have a moral obligation to stand up.
John Lewis certainly
speak
can
up,
speak to this.
Speak out.
That's him on the ground,
And make our
Senator
country
Wright, about to be beaten by an officer
a
during that
world
march
of
to
better
Selma.
place.
So the first march
We can
was
do it.
broken up by violence.
Thank you very
The
much.
second march would be far, far more successful.
The Selma to Montgomery March is the culmination of a long struggle for voting rights that triggers a national outcry. Bloody Sunday is beamed across the nation and across the world as the forces in Alabama are trying to turn back the idea that black people wanted to participate in the political process.
Now we had the right to march from Selma to Montgomery and to be protected. The governor, the sheriff department, and others would not interfere.
The march starts in Selma, crosses the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and makes it the 54 miles up through Lowndes County.
Down Highway 80. All the way to Montgomery. And off time we would stop to rest. Some brought food. It meant that some people were so determined to assist us.
I was 11 years old in the 6th grade, and my 6th grade class, we cleaned up at the campsite. My class was part of the cleanup crew. They camped out overnight for 4 different nights. They had a crew that would dismantle the tents, pack them up and move them up to the next campsite. They had a crew that did the same thing with the kitchen, the food, utensils and all that.
But during the course of this campaign, even before the march was finished,
Also, there were whites who were determined to holler and discourage those persons who were white who were participating in the march.
But during the course of this campaign, even before the march is finished, Lyndon Baines Johnson takes to the airwaves before a joint session of Congress and announces that he's going to put before Congress a voting rights bill.
It was a great feeling of accomplishment, knowing that we had done something that we felt would be beneficial to all persons, regardless of their color, whether they were black, white, red, or yellow.
You felt that something great was being accomplished. You just felt that there was an enormous happiness and an enormous joy that you had finally arrived, that even though all those things had gone against you, you was finally there.
Moving down Dexter Avenue in Montgomery, to the very right marched Jose Williams, holding his daughter. I marched next to him. Mrs. King marched next to me. Dr. King marched next to his wife. Dr. Ralph Bunch, the first African-American Nobel Peace Prize winner, marched next to him. And to his right marched Mrs. Abernathy. To her right marched her husband, Ralph Abernathy. And to his right marched John Lewis, who today is the United States coming from Georgia. And to his right marched A. Philip Randolph. On the way to the Capitol to hear Dr. King make that speech that day.
It culminates with Martin Luther King's iconic speech at the steps of the state capitol, where he asks, "How long, not long?"
I sat on that platform, looked out over that sea of humanity. I don't know how many thousand people were there, but I had a feeling of great triumph.
It's such an inspiring moment, and it would inspire the Voting Rights Act of 1965.
The right to participate in the political
even
process.
Though there were laws now preventing discrimination, not enough changed, and so the Voting Rights Act bans literacy tests, bans grandfather clauses, all the things that kept African Americans from voting, except for the poll tax, which would be banned by the 24th Amendment to the Constitution. That one, because it was a tax, took much more effort, and that definitely speaks to how entrenched these things were. But the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 clear out a lot of the legalized discrimination that was happening, though sadly it doesn't end racism. That is a fight that goes to this day.
Hi, I'm Yahuwah Williams. I'm a professor of history, and here's what you need to know to sound smart about the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was necessitated by the fact that the vast majority of African Americans in the South could not vote, despite the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Hi, I'm Yahuwah Williams. I'm a professor of history, and here's what you need to know to sound smart about the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was necessitated by the fact that the vast majority of African Americans in the South could not vote. Despite the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, many civil rights activists believe that the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was still necessary due to the denial of the right to vote of blacks in many Southern communities. Organizations like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and the Congress of Racial Equality have been active in registering African Americans to vote in the South with little success prior to the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. One of the reasons the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was so important is it helped to eliminate some of the mechanisms that had been used to suppress the right to vote for African Americans. This included the literacy test, the grandfather clause, and with the passage of the 24th Amendment, the dreaded poll tax. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 actually authorizes the United States government to oversee elections.
Unfortunately,
in
it would be not long
where there's
after
been a history or record
that Dr.
of
King
voter suppression.
was assassinated.
The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King
returned to
considered the
Memphis,
Voting Rights Act of
Tennessee,
1965
to help with a labor
to be an
strike
essential
of
piece of
mostly
legislation
African-American
to
workers,
guarantee civil rights for
and he was
African-Americans.
gunned down as he stepped outside his hotel room by James Earl Ray in April of 1968.
Does it feel like it's been 50 years? Feels like it was yesterday. It was April 4th, 1968.
1968 in Memphis, Tennessee. Before Andrew Young was an ambassador to the world. Before Jesse Jackson became a reverend and a groundbreaking political figure. They were two young men dedicated...
Does it feel like it's been 50 years?
Feels like it was yesterday.
It was April 4th, 1968 in Memphis, Tennessee. Before Andrew Young was an ambassador to the world. Before Jesse Jackson became a reverend and a groundbreaking political figure. They were two young men dedicated to the cause of equality, led by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And it was a chilly Thursday afternoon at the Lorraine Motel.
I was telling him he needed a coat, and he sort of raised his head to kind of test the weather, and pow.
A single shot to his chin, and King was dead. He was 39 years old. Now, a half-century later, Young and Jackson returned to the very spot where their friend and leader was assassinated.
His shoes got caught under here, and it knocked him out of his shoes.
A photographer who was staying 3 rooms down snapped this iconic image as King lay dying.
Now, we were pointing over there because the police were here. They were running over this way, and we were trying to tell them to go back that way. That's where the shot came from.
Do you think he heard the shot?
I don't think he heard the shot or felt it. I think it was a beautiful death. My first reaction was to be mad, and the second reaction was to say, well, if anybody is entitled to a reward, you have sure earned it. And, you know, take your flight to heaven.
Young went on to serve as congressman, as U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, and as mayor of Atlanta. Jackson continued social and political activism and ran for president twice.
Every move I made, whether it was a demonstration or running for the presidency, I always felt his spirit, and some way I touched base with him before doing it.
Jackson, now 76, and Young, 86, say King did not fear death. And even as they stand on the balcony that was once stained with King's blood, they're convinced that he will never die.
Turning to local news, it was after the death of Dr. King, riots broke out across the country in usually historically black neighborhoods. In Washington was one of the worst. People who had done nothing wrong, they had done everything right. Peaceful protests, they never struck back, they did everything right, and yet Dr. King was taken away from them. Their anger is palpable.
Afternoon. Seventh Street from the air looked like a row of smoking chimney pots, an isolated area of trouble. But even then, the trouble was spreading, and Mayor Walter Washington clamped on a curfew while officials canceled the Cherry Blossom Festival scheduled for this weekend. That was Washington by day.
This is how Washington looked from the air tonight. At one point early in the evening, more than 100 fires were burning, some of them in an area just 20 blocks from the White House. As the evening wore on, officials said the incidence of fires seemed to be lessening somewhat, that assessment based on a helicopter trip over the city. 3 deaths have been reported in the Washington rioting so far. There are no details yet on the circumstances surrounding them. More than 350 persons have been treated for injuries, among them several policemen and firemen. Firefighting was hampered, if for no other reason, by the sheer volume of the alarms. Some firefighting units were sent into the city from suburban areas. Looting spread to the downtown shopping section of the city, and as darkness fell, arrests increased. To this hour, more than 700 people have been arrested, some of them picked up in spot checks by police enforcing the curfew. More than 4,000 National Guard and regular Army troops moved into the city to reinforce the some 1,200 policemen on duty. They were dispersed at strategic points in the most troubled areas. Some of the regulars came in from nearby bases in Virginia and Maryland. Former Deputy Defense Secretary Cyrus Vance, President Johnson's troubleshooter in last year's Detroit riots, joined with Mayor Walter Washington in directing operations. The first night of disorders put this capital city on edge. Tonight has been far worse. and has still many more hours to go. Nelson Benton, CBS News, Washington.
The damage was incredible, and you can definitely understand the frustration of these people. Everything done right, and yet this still happens. And really, the death of Dr. King is the close of the civil rights movement as we know it in the 1960s. It would take more subtle and slow ways to try and advance this, with no real well-known leaders anywhere near the level of Dr. King or even Malcolm X. His death was the end of a chapter. But Dr. King gave a speech the night before he was assassinated, and I think it says so much of the character of Dr. King. It's prophetic. It's almost as though he knew, and it's incredible to know that the next morning he would no longer be with us.
Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead. But it really doesn't matter with me now, because I've been to the mountaintop. I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And he's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
The night before he was assassinated. And so I hope that someday we do reach that promised land and everyone does treat each other with the welcome respect that Dr. King so fought for. It pains me to say that we are not there yet. Racism is still very much a problem and is still very much around. But that will end this presentation of the civil rights movement as it continues to the present day. Thank you for listening, and I hope that you took some decent notes.